The men who died that morning were not reckless, and they were not unskilled. They were following orders, exactly as they had been taught. The doctrine was clear and unquestioned. B-25 Mitchell bombers were to attack from high altitude, 15,000 feet, straight and level. Bombs released through the Norden bomb sight, the most advanced targeting system the Army Air Forces possessed. In training films, the Norden could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel. On paper, it was precision perfected. Over the Bismarck Sea, it was a death sentence. From that height, a bomb needed 42 seconds to reach the water. In 42 seconds, a ship moving at cruising speed could change course, slide hundreds of feet, and leave the impact point empty. Japanese captains had learned this quickly. When they spotted American bombers high above, they didn't panic. They turned. They zigzagged. They waited. Below, anti-aircraft gunners had all the time they needed. The B-25 was fast in a straight line, but a bombing run demanded stability, not speed. The aircraft flew predictably, holding altitude and heading, while gunners walked their fire up into the formation. Crews watched black bursts of flak blossom around them, felt shrapnel tear through aluminum skin, and still held course because the manual demanded it. Bombs fell. Water erupted. Ships survived. Week after week, the results were the same. Aircraft came back riddled with holes or didn't come back at all. Official reports listed no confirmed hits. The conclusion was always identical: pilot error, insufficient discipline, improper technique. Paul Gunn watched the pattern repeat itself until it was impossible to ignore. He stood on the flight line and counted the empty revetments where aircraft used to sit. He attended memorials for men barely old enough to shave. He listened to instructors insist that the system worked, that the solution was better execution. Gunn knew better. He had flown. He had fixed airplanes. He understood weight, speed, time, and distance. The pilots weren't failing the machine was being asked to do something it physically could not do. The B-25 had been designed to bomb factories, rail yards, and airfields targets that didn't move. Against ships that could see danger coming and turn away, altitude was not protection. It was warning. And as long as American bombers stayed high, Japanese convoys would keep sailing and American crews would keep dying for nothing. Paul Gunn did not arrive at his idea in a flash of inspiration. It came from watching men die, one report at a time. By late February 1943, 17 B-25 crews had been lost in the Southwest Pacific trying to hit Japanese shipping from altitude. The paperwork described mechanical failures, enemy fire, bad weather. None of it explained the truth Gunn saw every day on the line: perfectly serviceable aircraft taking off and never returning, or limping back, torn open, their bombs having done nothing at all. The pilots knew it too. They came back shaken, angry, humiliated. They talked quietly in corners of the hangar about how helpless they felt watching bombs fall for nearly a minute while ships calmly slid out of the way, flying straight while gunners tracked them like clay pigeons, hoping skill or luck might save them when physics would not. One of those pilots was Edward Martinez, 24 years old, 6 missions flown, 6 misses. On the morning his B-25 disappeared over the Bismarck Sea, Gunn had watched him climb to altitude knowing exactly what would happen next. The Japanese would see him, the guns would open up, the bombs would miss. Whether Martinez lived or died would be decided by flak, not by his ability. Martinez never came back. That evening, Gunn stood alone in the maintenance hangar and stared at the B-25 seconds, parked in a neat row. Identical machines. Identical glass noses. Identical armament. Each one built to fight a war that did not exist in the Pacific. The solution, once Gunn allowed himself to think it, was brutally simple. If bombs from high altitude gave ships time to escape, then altitude had to go. If low altitude meant instant death from anti-aircraft fire, then the guns had to be silenced first, not suppressed, not distracted, destroyed. That meant firepower, overwhelming firepower, concentrated forward. The B-25's glass nose was the problem and the opportunity at the same time. It housed the bombardier and the Norden bomb sight, a shrine to a doctrine that was killing crews. It also prevented the aircraft from carrying serious forward-firing weapons. 1. 30 caliber machine gun was useless against steel decks and armored gun tubs. Gunn imagined something entirely different. A bomber that did not circle or line up from miles away, but charged straight at a ship at wave-top height. A machine that cut down gunners before they could aim. A plane that released its bombs from so close the target could not move fast enough to survive. To do that, the B-25 would have to be transformed from a bomber into a gunship. The regulations were explicit. Structural components could not be altered without authorization. Armament changes required approval from engineering command. Crew positions could not be removed or reassigned. Every rule existed for good reason in peacetime design offices thousands of miles away. None of those offices were burying pilots in New Guinea. Gunn made his decision without ceremony. He would not write a proposal. He would not wait for permission. He would build the aircraft he knew the pilots needed, using whatever tools and parts he had on hand. He began at night, when the hangars were quiet and questions were fewer. He chose an aircraft already damaged, one with a cracked glass nose that could plausibly be repaired. Cutting torches removed plexiglass and framing piece by piece until the bombardier's station vanished, leaving an open cavity where Doctrine used to sit. In its place, Gunn welded metal, aluminum sheets scavenged from wrecks, steel brackets taken from broken mounts. The new nose was heavier, rougher, and unapologetically functional. Into it, he mounted the 50 caliber machine guns, first 4, then more aligned to converge at close range, exactly where a ship's gunners would be standing. The work violated manuals, checklists, and common sense. It also solved the one problem no one else was willing to confront. When Gunn finished, the aircraft no longer looked like a bomber. It looked like a weapon built for one purpose only: to fly straight at the enemy and make them die before they could react. The war had not changed yet, but inside that hangar, the rules already had. The first test did not happen in a laboratory or on a drawing board. It happened in the air, with Gunn himself in the cockpit. He was 43 years old, officially too old for this kind of flying, but there was no chance he would ask someone else to risk their life in an aircraft he had altered with his own hands. If the center of gravity was wrong, if the recoil tore the nose apart, if the plane pitched into the ground when the guns fired, he would be the one to pay for it. At dawn, the modified aircraft rolled down the strip and lifted into the humid New Guinea air. It handled differently, heavier in the nose, slower to respond, but it flew. That alone meant the idea had survived its first trial. The real test came days later. The target was a Japanese-held airfield, protected by anti-aircraft guns and lined with fighters parked wing to wing. Under the old doctrine, bombers would have attacked from altitude and hoped for damage. Gunn did not climb. He went in low, skimming over the terrain, invisible until the last moments. When the anti-aircraft guns opened fire, he pressed the trigger. The effect was immediate and shocking. Multiple 50 caliber machine guns fired at once, their streams converging into a single zone of destruction. Gun pits disappeared in clouds of dirt and debris. Gunners were cut down before they could correct their aim. The aircraft shook under the recoil, but it held together, surging forward through its own wall of fire. Gunn pulled up and came around. Again, the gun spoke. Fighters on the ground tore apart, fuel igniting, metal folding in on itself. In minutes, the airfield was burning. Every aircraft returned. The reports confirmed what Gunn already knew. Anti-aircraft fire had been silenced before it could become lethal. The attackers had survived not by staying out of range, but by killing faster than the enemy could react. Word spread quickly. Pilots wanted the same modifications. Commanders wanted results. General George Kenney asked one question, and only one: did it work? When Gunn answered yes, the order was simple: build more. Now the idea scaled. B-25 Mitchells were pulled into hangars and stripped of their glass noses. Metal replaced plexiglass. Machine guns multiplied. Some aircraft carried 8 forward-firing 50 calibers, others 10, 12, even more. Ammunition filled the fuselage. Weight shifted forward, and Gunn compensated with ballast and revised procedures, recalculating balance the way only someone who truly understood aircraft could. The bomber was no longer a bomber. It was a strafer. Training changed with the machines. Pilots learned to fly at wave-top height, to attack head-on, to hold the trigger down, and trust the guns to clear the way. Bombs were no longer dropped from miles above. They were released from 50 feet, skipping across the water and slamming into hulls before ships could turn. The first convoy attacks were devastating. Ships that had once shrugged off high-altitude bombing were ripped open at the waterline. Crews that had calmly waited for bombs now had seconds to live. Anti-aircraft guns went silent before they could be used. Then came March 1943. Off the coast of New Guinea, a Japanese convoy steamed confidently through daylight. 8 transports and their destroyer escorts, carrying thousands of troops and months of supplies. Under the old rules, they would have been safe. They were not facing the old rules. B-17 seconds attacked from above, drawing attention and breaking formation. Then, low over the waves, the modified B-25 seconds arrived. They came in fast, almost invisible, guns already firing. Decks were swept clean. Bombs skipped and detonated. Ships burned, rolled, and sank in minutes. By the time it was over, the sea was filled with wreckage and bodies. Nearly an entire convoy had been erased in hours. The Japanese did not understand what had happened. They searched wreckage for new weapons, new technology, anything to explain the massacre. They found none. Nothing was new. It was the same airplane, the same guns, just welded into the right place and flown without asking permission. The impact of that day did not end when the smoke cleared over the Bismarck Sea. It rippled outward, quietly and relentlessly, through every level of the war. For the Japanese Navy, the lesson was immediate and terrifying. Daylight convoys, once the backbone of their Pacific logistics, had become death traps. Ships that had survived years of surface warfare were annihilated in hours by aircraft that did not behave the way aircraft were supposed to. Speed, altitude, and armor no longer mattered when an enemy could appear at wave-top height and tear a deck apart before a gunner could even swing his sights. Within weeks, Japanese orders changed. Major troop movements were pushed to night. Supplies were rerouted through submarines and fast destroyers. The sea lanes that had fed their armies began to starve them instead. In New Guinea, entire garrisons withered because food, ammunition, and reinforcements could no longer reach them in daylight. For the Americans, the results were just as dramatic, but far less visible. Pilots started coming home. Loss rates dropped. Missions that once felt like slow-motion suicides became violent but survivable. Crews who had expected to die on their next run began planning for the one after that. The strafer did not make them invincible, it simply gave them a chance. And that chance saved lives. Yet officially, none of it was supposed to exist. The modifications that had changed the air war violated regulations at every level. When inspectors finally noticed that B-25 seconds in New Guinea did not match factory specifications, reports were written and forwarded. Engineering officers in distant headquarters studied photographs and maintenance logs, trying to decide how something so unauthorized could be producing such extraordinary results. The question was never whether the idea worked. The numbers made that undeniable. The question was what to do about the man who had done it. Court-martialing Paul Gunn would have been easy. The manuals were clear. The evidence was undeniable. But so were the ships at the bottom of the sea and the pilots still alive to fly the next mission. No commander wanted to be the one who shut down a system that was saving crews and breaking the enemy. So, the paperwork stalled. Weeks passed. Then months. Quiet approvals replaced loud objections. Language was adjusted. Field modifications were acknowledged. Eventually, they were authorized. By the time official sanction arrived, the strafer was already proving itself across the Pacific. Manufacturers followed where mechanics had led. Engineers from North American Aviation studied Gunn's crude, welded designs, and refined them into factory models. New B-25 variants rolled off production lines with forward-firing guns built in from the start, cleaner, safer, officially approved versions of something that had once been illegal. Gunn's name, however, appeared almost nowhere. In reports, the innovation was attributed to field experience and tactical evolution. Credit dissolved into committees and phrasing that suited Gunn. He was not interested in recognition. He was interested in results. Those results were personal. Every ship sunk meant fewer Japanese troops supplied. Fewer troops meant less suffering for Allied soldiers and less strength for the enemy holding the Philippines. Somewhere in Manila, behind barbed wire and concrete walls, Gunn's wife and 4 children were still prisoners. He could not reach them with words or promises. He could reach them with destruction. Each mission flown, each convoy shattered, was another blow against the system that kept his family captive. The strafer was not just a weapon of war. It was Gunn's way of fighting for people he could not see and might never see again. By breaking the rules, he had changed how the war was fought. By refusing to stop, he ensured that change could not be undone. Paul Gunn never saw his work celebrated while it mattered most. By the time the strafer became standard, the war had already moved on, and so had the men who benefited from it. He continued to fly, mission after mission, even after his body began to fail him. He was hit repeatedly by enemy fire, wounded enough times that most men would have been grounded permanently. When a phosphorus fragment tore into his shoulder in 1944, partially paralyzing his arm, it finally ended his combat flying. He left the cockpit not because he wanted to, but because he no longer had the strength to fight the aircraft the way low-level attacks demanded. While Gunn recovered in Australia, the war he had helped reshape reached the Philippines. In February 1945, American forces liberated the Stowe Tomas internment camp in Manila. His wife and 4 children, starved, sick, and altered by 3 years of captivity, walked out alive. Gunn saw them again in a hospital ward, not on a runway. The youngest barely recognized him. The reunion was quiet. There were no speeches, no medals pinned to his chest in that moment. Just a man who had gambled everything on an idea, finally learning that it had bought his family time. After the war, Gunn returned to civilian life. He rebuilt airlines instead of bombers. He carried passengers instead of ammunition. The strafer lived on in museums, in maintenance manuals, in after-action reports stripped of names. His innovation was absorbed into doctrine, taught as if it had always been obvious. When Gunn died in 1957, flying the same type of small aircraft he had once escaped in at the start of the war, his obituary was modest. It listed his rank. It listed his medals. It did not explain why so many American air crews had lived long enough to earn theirs. The irony was fitting. The most important thing Gunn ever did was never officially his. It existed because he refused to accept what everyone else called unavoidable, because he trusted observation over doctrine, physics over paperwork, and responsibility over permission. The B-25 strafer was not a miracle. It was a correction. A simple welding job, a brutal idea executed without approval. A reminder that in war, survival often belongs not to the best equipped force, but to the one willing to admit the rules are wrong and change them before more people die. That is how Paul Pappy Gunn changed the war. War does not reward obedience the way institutions like to believe it does. It rewards accuracy about reality, about physics, about human limits. Paul Pappy Gunn's story endures not because he was brave in the conventional sense, but because he was honest about what was killing people. The official doctrine said the pilots were failing. Gunn looked at the wreckage and knew the doctrine was lying. That is the first lesson. Doctrine is not truth. Doctrine is only yesterday's best guess, frozen into rules. It is written far from the battlefield, by people who do not watch friends die from its mistakes. When doctrine stops matching reality, it becomes more dangerous than the enemy. In the Pacific, the rules said bomb from altitude. The math said bombs fall for 42 seconds. The Japanese ships simply turned. The result was predictable and lethal. Yet the system blamed pilots, not physics. It asked men to die, proving loyalty to a bad idea. Gunn refused to participate in that lie. He did not rebel loudly. He did not write manifestos. He did not demand authority. He did something far more threatening to bureaucracies. He solved the problem, which leads to the second lesson. Real innovation rarely comes from permission. It comes from proximity to pain. Gunn was not an engineer in a design office. He was a mechanic on a flight line. He saw the bullet holes. He counted the empty bunks. He attended the memorials. Innovation did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as exhaustion, as grief, as anger. Institutions prefer innovation to be tidy. Proposals, approvals, committees, timelines. War does not offer that luxury. Gunn understood that waiting for authorization meant more funerals, so he acted first and let paperwork catch up later. This is uncomfortable because it suggests a truth most organizations resist. The people closest to the problem usually understand it best, and they are often the least empowered to change it. Gunn welded metal in a hangar at night not because he was reckless, but because he was responsible. He knew that if he was wrong, the consequences would be immediate and likely fatal. That is not arrogance. That is ownership, which leads to another lesson. Responsibility is heavier than authority. Gunn did not hide behind orders. He did not say, "I was just following the manual." When he flew the first modified aircraft, he put himself in the seat. If the center of gravity was wrong, he would die. If the guns tore the nose apart, he would die. That is what responsibility looks like when it is real. Too often, failure is distributed so widely that no one truly carries it. Gunn concentrated both risk and accountability onto himself. That is why his solution worked. It was tested not by meetings, but by survival. There is also a lesson in what he changed and what he did not. Gunn did not invent a new weapon. He rearranged existing ones. The .50 caliber machine gun already existed. The B-25 already existed. The physics of low-altitude attack already existed. What Gunn changed was placement of guns, of tactics, of assumptions. This matters because it reveals another truth. Revolutions are often structural, not technological. They are about how things are combined, not what is newly created. Progress does not always look like invention. Sometimes it looks like refusing to accept a bad arrangement. The Japanese never found a new weapon because there wasn't one. There was only a new willingness to admit the old approach was wrong, and that terrified them. Which brings us to the psychological dimension of Gunn's work. The strafer did not just sink ships, it broke confidence. Before Bismarck Sea, Japanese convoys believed daylight belonged to them. After it, daylight became fear. Sailors refused to sail. Commanders altered plans. Entire campaigns slowed because supply lines withered under psychological pressure. This reveals a lesson often overlooked in military history. Morale is shaped by predictability, and it collapses when predictability dies. The Japanese knew how to counter high-altitude bombers. They did not know how to counter aircraft that ignored the script. Gunn didn't just change tactics, he destroyed the enemy's mental model of the battlefield. That is power far beyond tonnage sunk. There is also a deeply human lesson in Gunn's motivation. He was not driven by medals or legacy. His family was starving behind barbed wire. Every ship sunk was fewer supplies reaching the men who held them captive. Gunn's innovation was not abstract, it was personal. This matters because it contradicts the myth that effective leadership must be detached. Emotion did not cloud Gunn's judgment. It sharpened it. He did not lash out blindly. He did not seek revenge for its own sake. He focused his anger into precision. His love for his family translated into disciplined destruction of the systems harming them. This is an uncomfortable lesson because modern culture often equates professionalism with emotional distance. Gunn proves the opposite. When emotion is aligned with reality and responsibility, it becomes clarity. Another lesson lies in how the system responded after success. Once the strafer worked, institutions quietly adopted it. Manuals were rewritten. Factories integrated the design. Gunn's name faded. The idea remained. This is not injustice, it is pattern. Systems absorb success, but resist crediting disruption. Organizations prefer to pretend innovation was inevitable, planned, and orderly. They rarely acknowledge that it began as rule-breaking by someone willing to risk punishment. Gunn did not fight this. He did not demand recognition. He cared about outcomes, not authorship. There is a lesson there too. Impact matters more than acknowledgement. Gunn's reward was not a headline. It was pilots coming home. It was fewer families receiving telegrams. It was, eventually, seeing his own children alive. History remembers results longer than names. And finally, there is the quietest lesson of all. Gunn did not believe war made him special. He believed problems demanded honesty. The strafer was not genius. It was clarity under pressure. Gunn saw that altitude protected bombers from guns but exposed them to inevitability. He traded one risk for another, but he chose the risk that could be controlled. This is the final lesson. Progress begins when we stop confusing safety with familiarity. High-altitude bombing felt safe because it followed rules. Low-level attack was dangerous, but it was honest. Gunn chose honest danger over safe illusion. In the end, Pappy Gunn did not change the war by being louder, smarter, or more powerful than everyone else. He changed it by refusing to accept an answer that contradicted reality. He looked at death rates and asked why. He looked at physics and listened. He looked at rules and decided lives mattered more. That is not just a wartime lesson. It is a human one. There is a temptation, when looking back at stories like Gunn's, to turn them into legends and leave them there. Legends are comfortable. They let us admire courage without asking whether we would recognize the same truth under pressure. But the real value of this story is not admiration, it is discomfort. Because Gunn's situation was not unique. What was unique was his response. Every organization at war in 1943 had access to the same information Gunn did. Bombs were missing, ships were surviving, crews were dying. The data was visible in after-action reports and casualty lists. The difference was that most people treated those facts as unfortunate costs of doing business. Gunn treated them as evidence. That distinction matters. Evidence demands action. Costs invite excuse. When institutions accept failure as inevitable, they stop learning. They become emotionally invested in continuity, not effectiveness. Gunn did the opposite. He treated failure as an error signal, not a sacrifice to be honored and repeated. This is why innovation so often comes from outsiders. Retirees were called to service, mechanics, junior officers, and people who, technically, don't belong. They are not yet loyal to the illusion that the system cannot be wrong. Gunn had already lived a full career before the war began. He had already retired. He had nothing left to prove and nothing to lose professionally. That freedom mattered. It allowed him to see the situation clearly, which reveals another lesson. Career safety and intellectual honesty are often in conflict. Most people inside large systems learn, consciously or not, that survival depends on alignment. You are rewarded for reinforcing the existing model, not questioning it. Gunn was free from that gravity. He did not need promotion. He needed results. That freedom is rare and dangerous to bureaucracies. Because when someone like Gunn succeeds, it exposes an uncomfortable truth. The failure was never inevitable. It was tolerated. This leads to a moral lesson the story never states outright, but quietly implies. Not all deaths in war are caused by the enemy. Some are caused by refusal to adapt. That is not an accusation. It is a responsibility. War is chaotic, brutal, and unforgiving. But when the same mistake kills people repeatedly, responsibility shifts from fate to choice. Gunn understood that line instinctively. That is why he did not see rule-breaking as rebellion. He saw it as prevention. Another overlooked lesson is how narrowly Gunn defined success. He did not try to redesign the entire air war. He did not seek universal solutions. He solved one problem extremely well: how to kill shipboard gunners before they could kill pilots. That focus is important. Effective change is often local before it becomes global. Gunn did not wait for consensus. He built a working example. Once the example existed, arguments became irrelevant. Results spoke where theory had failed. This is how change actually spreads in high-risk environments, not by persuasion, but by proof. The strafer worked. Pilots survived. Ships sank. Everything else followed. There is also a sobering lesson in the violence of the solution. Low-level strafing was brutal. Men were killed on decks and in the water. The story does not romanticize this, and neither should we. Innovation in war often means becoming more efficient at killing. Gunn understood that clearly and without sentimentality. But here is the hard truth. Restraint is not the same as mercy when it prolongs suffering. High-altitude bombing felt cleaner, more distant, more civilized. It also prolonged the war, allowed resupply, and cost more lives over time. Gunn's approach was ugly, but decisive. War does not reward moral aesthetics. It rewards outcomes. This does not make Gunn's actions virtuous in a simple sense. It makes them tragic and necessary. He chose the path that ended the problem fastest, even if it meant confronting the ugliest realities of combat. That clarity is rare. Another lesson hides in the aftermath. Once the strafer became official, once factories built refined versions, the system moved on. Gunn's improvisation became doctrine, his rebellion became policy, and the urgency that created it disappeared. This is the cycle. Institutions forget the conditions that force them to change. They remember the solution, but not the fear, the losses, or the hesitation that preceded it. This is why organizations repeat mistakes in new forms. They preserve the answer without preserving the mindset that produced it. Gunn's mindset was not technical, it was ethical. He believed that when reality contradicts orders, reality wins. The ethical failure was not breaking rules, it was allowing rules to kill people needlessly. That belief is uncomfortable because it removes moral shelter. You cannot hide behind compliance if you accept it. Which brings us to perhaps the most important lesson of all. Courage is not defiance. It is clarity under pressure. Gunn did not shout. He did not posture. He did not seek confrontation. He simply refused to accept explanations that did not match evidence. His courage was quiet, methodical, and relentlessly practical. That kind of courage does not announce itself. It often goes unnoticed until long after the crisis has passed. And that is why Gunn's story matters now. Not because we fight wars the same way, but because we still face systems that mistake tradition for truth and procedures for safety. Whenever a process produces consistent harm and no one challenges it, Gunn's lesson applies. Whenever authority insists that outcomes are the fault of individuals rather than design, Gunn's lesson applies. Whenever people are told to wait for permission while damage continues, Gunn's lesson applies. The details change. The principle does not. Pappy Gunn did not believe he was changing history. He believed he was fixing a problem. History changed as a side effect. That is often how it happens. Not through grand strategy or visionary speeches, but through someone standing alone in a workshop, looking at a machine that keeps getting people killed, and deciding that the rules are no longer acceptable. In the end, Gunn's greatest contribution was not the strafer. It was the example he left behind. An example that says, when the cost of obedience becomes human lives, obedience is no longer neutral. When reality contradicts authority, reality must be trusted. And when no one gives you permission to save people, saving them anyway may be the most responsible choice you ever make. That is the quiet, enduring lesson of Pappy Gunn. Not that rules should always be broken, but that they should never be obeyed blindly, especially when the evidence is written in blood. If Gunn's story teaches anything beyond tactics and innovation, it is this: war does not forgive intellectual laziness. The battlefield is an unforgiving auditor. It does not care how elegant a theory looks on paper, how prestigious its authors are. or how long it has been taught. It asks only one question, over and over. Does this work? And when the answer is no, it extracts payment in blood. What makes Gunn unsettling as a historical figure is not that he broke rules, but that he exposed how fragile certainty becomes when reality refuses to cooperate. The bombing doctrine that failed in the Pacific was not foolish when it was written. It was logical, tested, and effective against stationary targets under controlled conditions. But the moment the enemy adapted, the doctrine became lethal inertia. That is the danger of systems that mistake precedent for truth. Gunn did not believe doctrine was evil. He believed it was conditional. And that belief put him at odds with an institution that relied on stability more than accuracy. Stability is comforting. It allows organizations to function at scale. But in war, stability can become stagnation, and stagnation becomes death. This is why Gunn's defiance mattered. It wasn't emotional rebellion. It was epistemological rebellion. He rejected how knowledge was validated. For the Army Air Forces, knowledge came from manuals, training cycles, and centralized approval. For Gunn, knowledge came from observation, repetition, and consequence. One was orderly, the other was honest. And honesty, in war, is terrifying. Because honest answers often imply uncomfortable actions. They demand risk, accountability, and the possibility of being wrong in public. Gunn accepted all of that. Most systems are designed to avoid it. Another lesson embedded in Gunn's story is how deeply organizations struggle to admit structural failure. When bombs missed, the reports blamed pilots. When aircraft were shot down, the reports blamed weather or enemy fire. Individual explanations were easier than admitting that the entire approach was flawed. This is a common human instinct. Personalize failure to protect the system. Gunn reversed that instinct. He understood that if many competent individuals fail in the same way, the problem is not the individuals, it is the design. And design problems cannot be fixed with discipline. They require change. This is a lesson far larger than aviation history. Whenever a system demands perfection from humans to compensate for its own flaws, it is already broken. The B-25 crews were expected to fly straight and level through flak for long seconds because the bombing method required it. The margin for error was zero. That is not a human problem. That is a system that assumes humans can behave like machines under fire. Gunn refused that assumption. He redesigned the system to match human limits instead of demanding humans exceed them. This inversion, designing around reality instead of denying it, is the core of every meaningful innovation under pressure. There is also a lesson in what Gunn did not do. He did not try to save every pilot. He did not promise safety. He did not chase invulnerability. The strafer was still dangerous. Low-level attack meant exposure. It meant recoil, stress, and brutal close combat. Gunn accepted risk, but he made it productive risk. That distinction matters. Unproductive risk is risk taken to preserve appearances, tradition, or convenience. Productive risk is risk taken to change outcomes. Gunn traded one type of danger for another, not because the second was safer in theory, but because it could be controlled through action. Pilots could suppress guns. They could choose angles. They could decide when to fire. At altitude, they could do nothing but wait. Control is survival. This is why pilots embraced the strafer almost immediately. It returned agency to them. They were no longer passengers in a bombing run. They were actors, and in combat, agency is as valuable as armor. Another layer of Gunn's story lies in timing. Had he tried the same modifications earlier in the war, he might have been ignored. Had he tried them later, the opportunity might have passed. Gunn acted at the precise moment when losses were undeniable, morale was fraying, and command was desperate for results. Innovation often requires not just insight, but urgency. And urgency is created by failure. This creates a paradox. Systems often need to fail visibly before they allow themselves to change. Gunn's tragedy and his necessity came from operating inside that window when failure had become too expensive to ignore. There is also a profound irony in how Gunn's work was ultimately legitimized. Once the strafer proved itself, engineers refined it, factories standardized it, and manuals incorporated it. The very system that resisted the idea eventually claimed it as its own. This is not hypocrisy. It is survival. Institutions cannot function if they celebrate rule-breaking as a norm. They must absorb innovation and erase its rebellious origins to maintain order. Gunn understood this instinctively. He did not fight for recognition because he knew the system could only accept the solution by forgetting how it was born. This tells us something uncomfortable about progress. Progress is often laundered to look respectable. The rough edges are smoothed. The risks are forgotten. The people who acted without permission fade into footnotes. What remains is the result, divorced from the courage that made it possible. Gunn accepted this trade without bitterness. He did not need the story to remember him. He needed the planes to work. Another lesson emerges when we consider Gunn's personal cost. He was not untouched by what he did. He flew dozens of combat missions. He was wounded repeatedly. He carried the physical consequences of low-level warfare for the rest of his life. The strafer saved others, but it did not spare him. This matters because it dispels the myth that innovators are protected by their own ideas. Gunn was not insulated by success. He paid for it in blood and pain like everyone else. Innovation does not exempt anyone from sacrifice. It redistributes it. And in Gunn's case, he accepted more than his share. There is also something deeply human in how his story resolves. After years of fighting to change the war, Gunn was reunited with his family, not on a victory parade route, but in a hospital. There was no triumphal return, just survival. That quiet ending is more honest than any ceremony could be, because war does not give closure, it gives continuation. Gunn went back to civilian aviation. He built airlines. He carried passengers safely across the same skies where he once hunted ships. That transition from destruction to connection is one of the most underappreciated parts of his legacy. It suggests another lesson. The skills that save lives in war are often the same skills that build peace afterward. Precision, respect for physics, responsibility for outcomes. Gunn did not become a different man after the war. He applied the same mindset to a different purpose. And yet, even in peace, the war followed him. He died flying, in weather, in an aircraft. The sky never truly released him. This is not poetic irony. It is realism. People who change history rarely escape it. Finally, Gunn's story challenges how we define heroism. He was not heroic because he killed thousands of enemies. That is an outcome, not a virtue. He was heroic because he refused to accept explanations that made death inevitable. Heroism, in this sense, is not bravery under fire. It is responsibility under uncertainty. It is the willingness to say, "This is wrong," even when the wrongness is invisible to those in power. It is the courage to act without guarantee of success or forgiveness. Gunn did not know the strafer would work. He only knew that the existing approach was failing. That is the moment where character is revealed, not when success is certain, but when failure is familiar and unacceptable. And that is why his story endures. Not because it features spectacular destruction, but because it captures a universal human dilemma. Whether to obey a system that no longer serves its purpose, or to risk everything to change it. Pappy Gunn chose the second path. He welded metal where glass had failed. He placed guns where theory had stood. He trusted reality over reputation. And in doing so, he left behind a lesson that extends far beyond World War II. When lives are being lost to habit, when failure is explained instead of corrected, and when waiting for permission becomes its own form of violence, the most responsible act may be to act first and accept the consequences later. That is not recklessness. That is moral clarity under pressure. And that, more than any weapon he built, is the legacy of Pappy Gunn. And when waiting for permission becomes its own form of violence, The most responsible act may be to act first and accept the consequences later. That is not recklessness. That is moral clarity under pressure. And that, more than any weapon he built, is the legacy of Paul Pappy Gunn.